parable is preparation, and the primary emphasis is watching for the Lord. If you're in Matthew chapter 13, this part of the Bible is probably almost completely read for you. We're going to be looking there here today, but that's almost entirely read. In many ways, you would call this the home stretch, as it were, for Jesus. You're only got a couple of chapters left in the book of Matthew, and Jesus is rattling off teaching sort of right and left. If you read chapters 23 and 4 and 5 and 6, there's a lot of teaching in those chapters from Jesus. But we're actually going to go one verse down to Matthew chapter 25 and verse 14. And in this verse, Jesus goes into his parable of talents. And like in the parable of the virgins, the talents is a parable of anticipation. I want us to think about anticipation for a second. When we think about what anticipation is, we're waiting for something. And we might describe it as being anxious or excited. You may have heard the term nervous anticipation, but there's something that's about to happen, and we maybe don't know exactly what it is. In the talents, it stresses the need to be productive. All of us have likely been at work, and our boss or maybe it's a new job has told us, this is what we need you to do each day. This is how you will be productive for us. And if you've ever lost a job, it might be because a lack of productivity. It emphasizes in the talents working for the Lord. And the reason that we would work, the reason that we would put our work go into action, as it were. And we'll look at all of that here over the course of our time this morning. This is the fourth of 5 lessons that we've been talking about making our calling and election sure. The first time that we met about this, we talked about putting on the whole armor of God. We also talked about how we should love our neighbor as ourselves. We talked about how that we should be careful in our choice of companions inside the church, outside the church. And this morning, we're going to think about how we could use our talents wisely. We're going to look particularly at Matthew chapter 25 in order to be able to do that. I want you to go with me. We're going to be reading Matthew 25, verses 14, all the way down through verse 30, but we're going to split it up into about 5 different parts, I think, 4 or 5 different parts. So let's look at 2 verses to start with. This is Matthew 25. We're going to look at verse 14 and 15. All of this is in red. Jesus saying, verse 14, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who has called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey." So let's talk for just a second about just the intro to this parable. You all are aware that parables are stories that were told, used quite often by Jesus, but they're not strictly limited to Jesus. Lots of parables have been told over time, but it's a method of explaining something in a common, understood way, right? You've all heard people that have tried to explain something to you and they've used all the technical language, right? And it doesn't make a lick of sense to you, right? How many of you have ever read the instruction manual on something that you have at the house and you said, you know what? Let me pull up a video on YouTube. I think that might explain it a little better, right? The guy on YouTube, he's electrified himself 3 times. He says, don't do this. Okay, I won't do that. But when we're reading that manual, it's like, oh, this is a little much. Parables were used as a way to explain something so that when you took it in, it's like, I can relate to that. And I think the story will work for us. This man in the story is about to go on a journey. And it said there, we read that he distributed his goods or his talents among his servants. So these are people that we can learn from 2 verses that are workers for him. They're servants for him. Let's talk about the word talent here for a second. The talent here is a monetary measure. Trying to look it up, get a good sense of what it is. I don't know if I can trust this, but you can just listen to me and just agree with me if you want to. But it said in what I read that a talent amounted to about 6,000 denarii. And that's the ordinary labor. It's about 20 years worth of money. I don't know if that's true, but I think what we can say is that it's a good bit of money that was left in the hands of these servants, right? You know, if I say I'm about to leave for a year and I toss a quarter your way, that's, you know, may not feel like that's a whole lot, right? But if I said I'm going to be gone for a while and I'm going to put you in charge of this $1 million business, that's a pretty big task. And so to get a sense of it, that's what we're talking about with talents. But it said there in the reading, the talent was given to them. How so? In the reading there in verse 15, it says it was given to them according to their ability, right? So they gave one servant got 5 talents, right? One servant got 2, and then one servant got 1. And so what does that tell you about the ability of the servants that were working for this man? Their abilities were not even, right? Our abilities are not even. Keep that in mind as we go forward when we talk about this. Let's go a couple more verses. This is verses 16 through 18. Continue with me. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. And likewise, cord got in the way. And likewise, he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. Verse 18. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. I want you to consider these 3 folks right here. They all had talents that were bestowed upon them, right? From the man who was they worked for. And so we read here in this description of how these talents were used. Let's talk about the 2 people first. 2 of the servants did what with the talents that they were given? We don't ask a lot of math questions in here, but I'll ask you a math question today. They did what with them, right? Doubled it, right? All right, you go back to math times 2, right? You double it, right? So 5 times 2 becomes what? 10, right? And 2 times 2 becomes 4. And anytime you're doubling, what are you doing? You're adding 2, right? It doesn't take much doubling before it gets real big, right? You know, 2 times 2 is 4. 4 doubled becomes, all of a sudden it becomes really big. So we see 2 of them that doubled what they had. But I want to talk for just a second about the other servant. What about the 3rd servant, the one who was given 1 talent? We read that he simply hid the money. Now, this may seem a bit strange to us, but I'm not sure that this wasn't a common occurrence at the time. In Matthew chapter 13 and verse 44, you can turn back if you want, but Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid, and for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has, and he buys that field. Now think about that for a second. Go hide a treasure in a field. Well, that sounds kind of like what the guy in this parable in Matthew chapter 25 did. He took his 1 talent. He said, I'm going to go bury this. One thing I know for sure is when I bury this, nothing will happen to it, right? If I bury it, it'll still be there. Now, you might think, well, they don't have financial institutions the way that we have, right? And maybe putting money in the ground is the safest place to keep it. Some of y'all may have lived in a time whenever putting money in the bank wasn't the safest thing in the world, right? Some of you that may have lived through the Great Depression, there are people I know that lived through the Depression that never put the money in the bank again. Now, at the end of that money started to get insured, but some people still interested. I was reading a book the other day. It's a novel, and they talked about how they had this rope bed, and it was this old bed that had stayed in the house into that because he knew that bed was his, and he was always going to have that money right there. Well, that's no different than the guy here who is putting this money in a field. Now, is it safe to bury the money? Sure. Does the money grow in the field? It doesn't. So let's go a little further. Matthew chapter 25, verses 19 through 23. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents besides them. Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Verse 22. He who had received 2 talents came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And I'm going to stop there for just a second, because we see in this story, we see in these handful of verses right here, that there was a reckoning made when the Lord comes back. It said at the beginning that he was going to be on a journey, right? So we don't know when he's coming back, but he does return back. And his return here is after a long time, according to verse 19. And so when he comes back, the first 2 servants are here to talk to him, right? The first 2 servants talk about how they doubled their money. How would you describe the way that they stood before the Lord in the story? I think there was some excitement there, right? I think there was some excitement to say, look, I took 5 and made it 10. If you have money with a financial advisor or something like that, and they call you and they say, I have recently invested in such and such stock, you put this money in, and look what we've done. And 6 months later, you have made, you're excited to hear that, right? And they're probably excited to call you and say the growth that's here. The same thing happens with these 2 guys. They say, I had 5, now I got 10. I had 2, now I've got 4. How was their Lord viewing them? Seems like he was pleased, right? He commends them as both. He says both of them. He says a good and faithful servant. 2 descriptions that we would love to hear, right? I like to be called good. That means I've done right. I like to be called faithful. That means I've done right for the person that I've worked for. He says, you good and faithful servant. But he doesn't just say that. He then says, he rewards them. He promises them, promotes them. He says, you were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. In a sense, what he's saying right here, I can trust that if I give you 5 talents, you're going to grow. Now, going forward, when I have to go on another visit, I might give you 10 talents. I might give you 20 talents. Point being, I'm going to give you something because you can grow from this. You have proven yourself worthy of working for me. He says, enter into the joy of your Lord. I would think that person 1 and person 2 in this story have been very successful. Is that a word that you would use for them? I think we could use the word successful. The longest set of verses that we'll read is right now. Let's look at verse 24 down to verse 30. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours. But the Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. Therefore, take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness, and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So let's spend a little time thinking about the 3rd person in this story. This servant had hidden his money from the Lord, right? And so he starts by making excuses. We can relate to that, right? Well, we do something wrong, or maybe we haven't quite done the way we should have. Excuses start to come up. Long-time school teacher, I've heard plenty of excuses, right? You all that have been in work, y'all know what these excuses. 24, he said, I knew you to be a hard man. It's like, I was nervous, didn't really know what to do. But then he says, but wait, I do still have what you gave me. Now, this is a way to sort of appease the Lord in the story, right? Because he says, I didn't go spend it. I didn't go throw it away. I didn't lose it. I still have what you gave me. So after this time has passed, and I don't know how long it is because the story says a long time, he says, I still got this. For some of us, I still have this can be a go-to answer. I can do this. What did the Lord in the story call him? He said a wicked and lazy servant. Wicked and lazy. Think about that for a second. Wicked is a really bad way to describe somebody, right? But lazy is kind of a bad way to describe somebody too. And you might be wicked but hardworking, and you might be smart but lazy. But he gave them both. He said, you wicked and lazy servant. It's like a double punch, one right after another. He says, you wicked and lazy servant. He said, the least you could have done is deposited my money with the bankers, right? I don't know what banking looked like back then, but it sounds like there was interest that existed, right? He said, you could have at least put it in the bank. Every now and then when we get our bank statements, you'll see that little bit of interest. Well, it ain't a lot, but it's, 10 cents is better than none. I guess it grew some, but he said, you could have at least deposited it with the bank. But not only that, then, what does he do with the talent he gave? He took it, right? He took it from the guy. He said, I can't trust you with this. And he gave it to the guy who had 10. If I'm not mistaken, that guy had 5 at the beginning of the story, right? So he'd grown as he gave it to him. He then said that this was an unprofitable servant. Think about that for a second. Profitable, to make a profit, to make money in some kind of venture. Businesses have to make profit, right? Businesses make profit by making money. They have to grow. He said, you as a servant are unprofitable. You're bringing nothing for us. Wicked, lazy, unprofitable. Now think about that for a second. He trusted him to give him the one talent. So it wasn't like he looked at this guy and said, I just can't give this guy anything, right? He said, I trust by your ability to get this. Now, his ability wasn't as good as the 5 or the 2, but he got something. When he comes back, he says, wicked, lazy, unprofitable. He didn't do anything with what had been given to him. Let's talk about using our talents and opportunities. Let's consider talent, opportunity, ability, all the same thing for the sake of this. I think it's important to note, to start with, not all Christians have the same talents. We have to consider that right off the bat. There have been years where we've been fussed at school for a student who didn't make certain grades. And I said, well, you know what? This student started out as an F and we got them to a C. No, they're not an A, but they've made some progress, right? If a kid starts out with an F and we get him to a C, that's pretty good. If a kid starts with an A and we lose him to a C, that's not very good, right? But some people have more talent than others. Christians are the same way. Opportunities might be different. Nature of opportunities might be different. Paul talked about this in Romans. Go to Romans chapter 12 for just a second, and let's look at Romans chapter 12, verses 3 through 8. Paul's talking to the Romans, and he said in Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 3, for I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt each one a measure of faith. For as we have many members in one body, but all members do not have the same function. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Of ministry, let us use it in our ministering. He who teaches in teaching, he who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, and he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. There's all kinds of things listed right there. This wasn't the only time that Paul wrote about this. He talked about the arm and the leg and the head and all that kind of stuff. But he says, whatever this gift is, use it, right? Whatever the gift is, use it. Just look at those last couple right there. He who shows mercy, show it with cheerfulness. I can be kind to you, but be mean at the same time. He says, if you're going to be showing mercy, if that's your gift, do it cheerfully. A couple others right there. He who gives, give liberally, with liberality, right? No, don't just give because you have to, but do it with joy. Acts chapter 6 and verse 2 described the apostles, and it talked about how they needed a deacon-like position in the church. But it implies in Acts 6 and verse 2 that some are to teach and some are to serve. That's a good example of how there are jobs and there are talents within the church. We have gifts that differ according to the grace that's in us. Some abilities are easier to determine than others. Think about this for a second. In some cases, our abilities are pretty evident, right? You ever heard somebody lead singing for the first time, and you said, man, that person's really good. You ever heard somebody teach or preach or do anything, and for the first time, you're like, oh, man, that person is really good. Sometimes it's obvious a talent that's in people, but sometimes it's not quite so obvious. Sometimes it might be hidden. Sometimes it's dormant but needs to be awakened, right? And so when the elders ask you to do something, they're in most cases looking at you in that second and third way, right? Not this obvious talent, but there's a talent that's dormant. There's a talent that's there. There's a belief that you can grow this talent. You may not have been, obviously, the 5-talent person. That person that stands up and leads singing for the first time, like, man, they could sing at the opera. That's a 5-talent person. You might be more of the 2 or the 1. But the thing is, they see that in you. What did the Lord give the 1-talent man? He gave it to him. He said, you take this. But he didn't do it. Your talent might be hidden, but it can't stay hidden. You can't keep it shoved to the side. No, I don't think I can do that. So how do we determine our abilities? I think there's 3 things up here on the board. Number 1, through trial and error, right? You know what trial and error is, right? Step up, do it. Tom said to me, he's lead singing. He said, you might want to pray for him, right? Tom did a fantastic job. But I guarantee you, that's not the first time Tom's led singing, but it's one of the earlier times. But it's a trial and error process. And one of the things you learn as a song leader is there are some songs that you can sing, and there are some songs that you can't sing. All right. Josh is shaking his head. He knows exactly what I mean, right? I will never, if we live to be a million, I'll be a friend of Jesus. I have nothing against the song. I can't lead it. Right? I know where my talents are, right? There are songs that you say, I can't do that. But if I said, well, I sang I'll be a friend of Jesus one time and messed it up, so I'm never leading singing again. There's 1,028 songs in this book and a bunch more that aren't in the book that you know, right? Can we let ones, I can't do the one, so better not do it at all. See, sometimes we keep that talent hidden away because I'm not real good at this one thing. I know 650 songs, but this one is not very good, so I can't do it. That's hiding our talent away. Trial and error is how we determine our abilities. Second, once we've determined our abilities, we can't settle for it. You know, church is a lot like work, right? There's a girl or there's a guy that can handle that, right? You know, I'm the preacher, right? So you don't have to worry about that. I'm the preacher. But then we got the tech guy, right? We got the tech girl. We've got the communion lady. That's her job, whatever it is. Well, that's fine to have that job. But what if that's your only task? Are you limiting yourself? But I think we're also limiting the church as well. No. This is that person's job only. But what if that person falls over dead? It's all gone, right? Well, we never trained a soul. 45 people in the room, never once trained a soul to replace this person, right? That's difficult. But if we say, I have a little talent, but I want to bury it over here, I can't come out of that. We have a guest speaker every single month. I appreciate it because I don't have to do it every time. But more than that, I've seen people that are in this church that have went from okay preachers to quite good preachers just because of practice, just because of effort, just because of the ability to do it. I've seen people step up here very nervous, but then the next time, not so much. I remember the first time Kevin spoke up here. We got in 5 minutes, I believe. It was a quick one, right? He was nervous about it. Now he doesn't seem nervous at all. Why? A little bit of effort, a little bit of work, practicing it. I can do this. That's what our talents have to be. Kevin's talent grew from 2 to 4, from 5 to 10. He didn't bury his 1 out in the field. We have to be open to suggestions as well. If somebody says you should teach the class, do it. The easy answer is to say, oh, no, I could never do that. Are there things in this building that you think, no, I could never do? You're all nervous to shake your head on that right now. If there's anything in this building, anything in this congregation that you think, no, I couldn't do, I don't know how you do this right now, but if you can erase that spot from inside your head, do it. Because here's the thing. The man with 5 talents took his and made it 10. The man with 2 took his and made it 4. When you say, oh, no, there's no way I can do that, you took yours to the field and buried it. It's there. It's there. You've got it. But when the Lord came back in the story and the guy said, dug it up and said, here it is right here, how was he treated? So my thought is, when we say, oh, no, I could never do that, what are we going to take to the Lord when this time on earth is over? I could have done that, but I didn't do it. I was nervous about it, so I couldn't do it. I was worried because you're a hard man, and I thought if I stepped up there and taught and I misspoke or I said the wrong scripture verse, I'd get in trouble, and that might keep me out of heaven. So I buried it over in the corner. Our talent has to be used. If you take anything from the parable, I hope it's that diligence is rewarded while negligence is punished. I'm going to look at a couple of things that are here on the screen. I think they'll pop up here one after another, so it'll get ahead of me, I'm sure. But we are stewards of gifts bestowed upon us by the Lord. We have opportunities for service, and in keeping with our ability, we have to use them. Jesus didn't expect an immediate return on our talents. Just like the man in the parable, he gave the talents and left. He left them alone for a bit. But what he did expect was that what was done with those talents had an eye on the future. 5 becomes 10, 2 becomes 4, 1 doesn't stay 1. Our responsibilities are in preparation for an eternal future, right? What became of the third person? What became of the third person in the parable? It said punishment was reserved for unprofitable servants, and sins of neglect are just as bad as overt acts. Same punishment existed for both. It's hard to say that the person in the parable did wrong. They didn't really do wrong, but they sinned out of neglect. They didn't take what they had and grew it. They didn't take that money and lose it. They didn't take that money and blow it as the prodigal son story on rides. They didn't do any of that kind of stuff. But it was a sin of neglect that saw them be punished. We have to be productive when and where our abilities have been given to us. We can't limit our abilities to just what I think I can do and never try to grow. Whatever that case is for us, whatever your talents are, I hope, and I don't mean this to be a New Year's resolution, but I hope going forward that we'll try to grow those talents. Some of us are sitting on 5, some on 2, some on 1. But whatever we're sitting on, they all have the ability to grow. But it takes the work of us to do that, not just hide it away. We talk each time that we come together about an invitation. If there's anything that we can do for you, it might be that you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. It might be that you've wasted some talent and you'd like